There is a stretch of asphalt just outside of Oakhaven, known as Blackwood Lane, and the locals share one unbreakable rule: never drive it after midnight. They say the heavy fog swallows headlights, and those who ignore the warnings simply vanish without a trace. It sounded like a cheap urban legend designed to scare teenagers, but as an investigative journalist, I knew every local myth usually hides a buried truth. I arrived in Oakhaven on a crisp autumn afternoon, determined to uncover the logical explanation behind these supposedly supernatural disappearances. 3 separate travelers had vanished on that exact road over the last decade, leaving their families desperate for answers. The police reports were infuriatingly vague, citing bad weather and poor visibility. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I did believe in human secrets, and I intended to expose them. Sitting in the local diner, I asked the waitress about the road. The lively chatter around me instantly died down. She paused, gripping her coffee pot tightly, and told me that some doors in the world are simply meant to stay closed. The genuine fear in her eyes wasn't an act. It was a deeply ingrained communal terror that only made me more eager to drive the route tonight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I turned my rental car onto Blackwood Lane. Almost immediately, the atmosphere shifted completely. Massive, ancient pine trees crowded the narrow shoulders, their branches forming a claustrophobic canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The promised fog began to roll in, thick and heavy, crawling across the hood of my car like a living thing. My headlights barely pierced the dense gray wall. The deeper I drove, the more profound the isolation became. I glanced at my dashboard and watched my cell phone signal completely drop out. The local radio station I was listening to dissolved into a sharp, hissing static before I finally snapped it off. The silence that filled the cabin was overwhelming, amplifying the steady, anxious beating of my own heart. I was entirely cut off from the world. 2 miles in, my headlights swept across a jarring sight. Parked perfectly on the shoulder was a late-model sedan, completely covered in a thick layer of autumn leaves and dust. I pulled over, my pulse quickening, and grabbed my heavy flashlight. Approaching the vehicle cautiously, I shined the beam through the driver's window. The keys were still hanging in the ignition, and a half-empty water bottle sat untouched. I stepped back, sweeping my flashlight across the damp earth bordering the asphalt. There were no shattered windows, no bloodstains, and absolutely no signs of a struggle. Instead, I found a clear, undisturbed set of footprints leading deliberately away from the car and directly into the dense, dark tree line. Whoever was driving had simply parked their vehicle, stepped out, and chosen to walk into the freezing, unknown forest. Driven by an overwhelming need for answers, I zipped up my jacket and followed the trail into the woods. The dead leaves crunched loudly beneath my boots, breaking the suffocating silence. I couldn't shake the intense, prickling sensation that I was being watched, but it didn't feel malicious or threatening. It felt observant, like a quiet neighborhood watching a stranger slowly walk down their street in the middle of the night. The makeshift path grew steeper, winding up a rocky incline. Along the way, my flashlight illuminated strange, discarded objects. First, I found an expensive leather briefcase resting against an oak tree. A few yards later, a cracked smartphone lay abandoned in the dirt, followed by a luxury wristwatch hanging carelessly from a branch. It was a breadcrumb trail of modern anchors, willingly cast aside by someone moving forward. The mystery was fundamentally shifting in my mind. These weren't victims of a monstrous predator or a malicious criminal. People do not neatly discard their most valuable possessions while running for their lives. They were shedding the weight of their identities. Whatever lay at the end of this trail was something they deemed vastly more important than the expensive, complicated lives they had spent years building back in civilization. I finally reached the top of the ridge, breathless and freezing. I clicked off my flashlight, expecting to peer into an empty, dark abyss. Instead, I looked down into a massive, hidden valley, and my breath caught in my throat. Below me was the warm, flickering glow of dozens of lantern lights, illuminating a sprawling, rustic settlement composed of sturdy log cabins and vast, carefully cultivated community gardens. It wasn't a crime scene. It was a sanctuary. I slowly made my way down the hillside and walked into the quiet village. A man chopping firewood paused and looked up at me. I instantly recognized his face from an old missing persons file. He was a high-profile corporate lawyer who had vanished 3 years ago. He smiled warmly, looking healthier and more at peace than in any photograph. He invited me to sit by his fire and explained the profound truth of Blackwood Lane. The people who disappeared here didn't die. They defected, overwhelmed by debt, grief, or the crushing pressure of the modern world. They had stumbled upon this hidden, self-sustaining commune. Once they experienced the pure, quiet simplicity of this off-grid existence, they made the conscious, difficult choice to never return to the lives they hated. The terrifying urban legend was a carefully constructed lie, created and maintained by the locals of Oakhaven. They loved this hidden community and wanted to protect it from intrusive developers, aggressive media, and the chaotic influence of the outside world. By keeping the supernatural rumors alive, they ensured that the only people who ever ventured down Blackwood Lane at night were those desperate enough to truly need a sanctuary. I drove back to town the next morning, leaving my notebook entirely blank. Sometimes the greatest mystery isn't how people manage to disappear, but why they feel the overwhelming, heartbreaking need to escape in the first place. I submitted an article blaming the disappearances on treacherous driving conditions, choosing to protect their secret. We all need a place to hide, and maybe Blackwood Lane is exactly where it belongs.